Ezekiel is going to look me up when I get to heaven and say, why did you go over this book, this fantastic book, so quickly? I'm going to just try to avoid him as long as I can. This is about it. I'm a little bit more, but here's Ezekiel. Ezekiel is the Jeremiah of Babylon. What that means is what Jeremiah was doing over here in Jerusalem, that is being thrown into a pit, kind of being abused, sort of testifying that the reason the exiles come is because of your sinfulness. Ezekiel is doing that over here in Babylon, saying, look, the reason why you guys are here is because you've messed up. Right now, again, you might think, well, duh, wouldn't they know that? And again, what we're running up against is the incredible ability of the human mind to rationalize their own sin. And they don't get that. Right? They think, well, our military wasn't very big, and Ezekiel says, no, you're the problem. So Ezekiel's basic ministry is that. Same thing Jeremiah was doing over there, Ezekiel is doing here. What I want to show you today, though, is some of the unique special parts of Ezekiel that are going to throw out ropes or threads to the New Testament in pretty cool ways, I think. Right? But before I get to that, I should say this. The very last thing I want to say about Daniel 9 is this. I want to take Daniel chapter 9 and all that stuff we took a look at on Monday and say that Daniel 9 fits on top of here as another important installment in the Messianic teaching. Because you know what the first 4 levels talk about, right? What are the first 4 levels about? They all discuss the same thing in common, that is who. Where is he coming from? He's coming from Eve, he's coming from Abraham, coming from Judah, and coming from David. Micah then talks about not who, but what? Where, and Daniel's going to talk about when. Yeah, right? So the whole picture is getting filled in here. Right? So, with that then, let's get on to the story of Ezekiel, and here's where I want to go. I want to drop us down into the event about 592 BC. Now let me help you place that chronologically a little bit. 592 BC, we're still over here in Jerusalem, right? Because the exile doesn't occur until 586, so negative numbers, 592, we're still here, the temple is still here, but what's going to happen is, because of the horrible, unspeakable contempt for God's house, God is going to leave his house and not come back for a long time. So I want to show you the maps here and show you that place. In fact, I might just kind of darken it down a little bit. See if that will help. So you can see the maps a little bit better. And what you're looking at here is a picture of overhead of Jerusalem, I'm sure you can see. And whenever you see this little black T kind of thing in the middle, that's kind of a giveaway. That's the temple. Okay? So that's the temple. This whole area up in here is the Temple Mount. This down here is the city of David. And David's city originally was right here, but then it expanded all the way out to here, and Solomon built the temple area up there. Okay? So, overview of the way the city looks. Now, here's a little bit easier way to look at the same thing. You can see the city of David down here. You can see the temple right here, the temple proper, and then the whole temple precincts or area, whatever you want to call it, right there. Now, that area, that rectangle that goes, come on, I lost my hair. That rectangle that goes from here to here to here is about the size of 17 football fields. So imagine, this is much, much bigger. This is just a little model, but don't realize how big it is. And you see this little walkway that looks like, you'd fall off it if you were going up it. To get a really better perspective, here's what it looks like up close. It's just this gigantic thing, and we know it was there because it's been destroyed from here on up, but and of course out here it's fallen off. But we can see the size of the arch and how big it was, and that's a really faithful representation of what it looked like. So the temple was just absolutely massive. It was beautiful. It was high. When you'd walk into it, it would go up 70 feet inside. In some ways, it is totally conspicuous consumption, like wasted space, except that the whole goal of the architecture was to help you feel small in the space where God lives, right? To give you a sense of his majesty. So, huge, huge temple there. Here's what it looks like from the east side. Here's the temple proper. the 17 football fields area in here. And then this spot over here, I want to show it to you because it becomes important. That area there, if you go inside of it, again, looks like this. This is where the money changers would have been. So a huge, massive, beautiful structure that any little Jewish kid living in Babylon would make sand temples of. Right? Just gorgeous, beautiful thing. So where I want to go then is this. Here's another drawing of it. And I want to show you a picture from the west side looking to the east. Right? So here's what it looks like today. This is that Dome of the Rock that we talked about last time. Dome of the Rock built right over the spot where the temple would have been. And so what you have out here, right behind it, is the Valley of Kidron coming down this way. And then over here is the top, the ridgeline of the Mount of Olives. It's all going to become important here in a second. The discouraging thing about the Dome of the Rock being there, not discouraging thing, but the understated thing, is that the temple would have stood up almost twice as high as the Dome of the Rock does. So in the way this dominates things right there, the temple was even greater and bigger. All right? So here is where we are then in Ezekiel chapter 8. The Spirit of God, the Shekinah glory, the glory cloud, the fire, the pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day, is there living in the Holy of Holies. And here's the situation in Ezekiel chapter 8. Ezekiel is speaking. Ezekiel is actually in Babylon, and he speaks about this angel in a vision who transports him back over here to Jerusalem to see this. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem. Right? So at least he is transported so he can see. To the entrance to the north gate of the inner courts. So that spot, the north gate of the inner court, is right there. North is that way to the top of the screen, and that's the inner court. Where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. Now, you say, what kind of idol was this? I don't know what kind of idol it was, but obviously what it did was provoke God to jealousy. And obviously so, right? You're going to take an idol and you're going to put it in God's house. I mean, not directly in the house, but certainly in the courtyard. Right? So imagine, just to get the sense of outrage, let's go back to the Hosea and Gomer story. Imagine Hosea comes home from work one night and finds the door locked with her lover inside. At that point, Hosea is going to say, okay, I don't think I even want to go into that house. And this is how God is, right? You have this idol, and it's sitting right there, and there before me was the glory of God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. So, watch what happens next here. There's another picture of it, and that's where the idol would have been, somewhere in there. Here's a picture from the south, looking at these steps. Here's, again, a model of it today. And here's an actual picture of those steps today, going up to the temple, just to give you a sense of what's still left over there. Right? So here's what happens next then. Ezekiel 8. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things the house of Israel is doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. But you will see things that are even more detestable. So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals, all the idols of the house of Israel. So to make matters worse, they not only have these idols in there, but they have drawn pictures of animals in there. Now again, it reminds me of, and probably should you, of Romans chapter 1, right? When they ignored God, they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So these are a group of people who are really bankrupt, and not just bankrupt spiritually, but put their fist in God's face and say, hey, let's worship these things in God's house. And God's going to say, if you're going to do that, I'm not going to stay. So here's where we go next. Ezekiel chapter 9. Now the glory of the Lord, glory of the God of Israel, went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. So the cherubim, the Ark of the Covenant, remember that, with the angels on the side, kind of the bodyguards, which is an oxymoron with God, the spirit guards, whatever, sitting on the side of his throne in the Holy of Holies, right in there. It comes out and moved to the threshold of the temple. So just a little red arrow coming right out. Then, I'm not going to read the rest of chapter 9. Let's go to chapter 10. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple, stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house. So it goes all the way out to here. Now what you're going to see is that this happens in successive stages. And this is kind of the impression you get. Like, God just doesn't take off and go, just go straight up. You know, he says, okay, I can't stay here, I've got to leave. He leaves and then kind of stops and longingly looks back, like, oh man, I don't want to go. But they're forcing me. And then another chapter goes, and he goes a little farther and stops and looks back, like, oh man, I don't want to go. Right? So you've got this happening over Ezekiel 8 and 9, and then watch where we are next. And here we are in Ezekiel 11. Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings. The glory of God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. Now, the mountain east of it is the Mount of Olives. One that we know a lot about, especially because of the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, right? So what happens is the Spirit of God moves out further, and then moves out to here, goes to the Mount of Olives, and ascends into heaven. Right? Now, the sad thing is that he doesn't come back. When Zerubbabel comes back and rebuilds his temple out of all that there, all that, you know, then you would expect in the Spirit of God to come back in the same way he left, but of course he didn't. We've been over that several times before. So when does he come back? Well, watch this. This is what that eastern gate looks like. The eastern gate is right there, okay? And if you're down here in the valley of Kidron, you're looking up, you see it look like that, and it's been not boarded up, stoned up, or closed up anyway. We'll talk about that later. And so here's where we go next. I want to go to Luke 19. This is the date this is the triumphal entry. That really, really important day of presentation when Jesus comes. He gets on the donkey at a place called Bethpage, right, which is right here, right on the Mount of Olives. So he gets on the donkey and starts to ride into town to present himself to see if they will take him as their king. And they do say, I think I've said this to you before, yes, we do have a crown for you, a crown of thorns, and you're not going to be our king. Well, what happens next then is this. In Acts chapter 1, it's about 40 days later. Okay? 40 days later, Jesus is there with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Now, don't be confused. The angels are speaking in Acts chapter 1 to the disciples who are men of Galilee, but they're not in Galilee. These are men of Galilee who are sitting on the east side of Jerusalem. Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who's been taken up from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. So, it's kind of an interesting pattern here so far, right? The Spirit of God comes out in Mount of Olives and goes up. Jesus comes out to Mount of Olives and goes up. It's like it's the divine heliport sort of thing. Okay? And then what's really interesting to me is what the angel says to the men of Galilee, to the disciples, and says he's going to come back the same way. Why does he say that? Well, because in Zechariah it says, on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two. So what it's saying is that when Jesus comes back, he will come back to this very spot. So I don't think the angel was kidding or was overstating the case when he said this same Jesus who went up from you will come back in the same way, in the same spot. Because this is where God, in whatever person he's in, this is where God comes down. And so Jesus will come down, according to Zechariah 14 in Acts chapter 1, the very same spot where the Spirit of God from the book of Ezekiel went up, come down, probably retrace his steps like he did the first time, except maybe on a war horse instead of a donkey, but probably come in and then come right up to the eastern gate, which brings us here. This is why the gate is closed up, because people have read the prophecies and know the prophecies and don't want them to come true. I don't know how logical this is. Jesus comes down, splits the mountain in two, comes up and says, oh my goodness, it's closed. What are we going to have to cancel the second coming, I guess. How are we going to get through that, right? know how in the world could you get through there? I mean, but again, I guess it's kind of how we think. But again, it's a really picturesque thing here with the Dome of the Rock in the background and the eastern gate there. So there's even more to it than this. What I want to show you is a really interesting phenomenon in Israel. Maybe some of you have seen this before, but I want to show you where this little oval is, because this is on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. Right? And I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like from the west looking to the east. This is kind of fascinating, I think. Here's what it looks like. This is at nighttime, and you can see all these little, it's just filled and dotted with all these little blocks. It's kind of hard to tell what they are. But during the daytime, you can see them. Here's what they are. You see? These are graves. And in Israel, you don't put flowers on graves, you put rocks on graves. Number one, they last longer. Number two, they're cheaper or whatever. But even if you've ever had a chance to watch Schindler's List, the story about the guy who saved so many Jewish people, who's actually buried about 700 yards from where the cemetery is, you'll find at the end of the movie, all the actors and the real people involved walk by and they put a stone right on top of his grave. Now, why are these people here? Why do so many people want to be buried on the hillside right here? Well, the only answer is, because this is not a real pretty cemetery, but this is, for a believer, a front row seat, right, to everything that's going to happen. If you really believe the Messiah is going to come back and split the Mount of Olives in two and walk into the city, this is a great place to watch. And I think this is a place where faithful people are buried who want to see that, who believe in that kind of thing, right? Whether or not they would believe that Jesus is it or not, at least from reading from Zechariah 14, they think Messiah is going to come back there. And so you kind of see it. Now, let me just wrap this whole thing up and say this. Does this then make any sense to you? Does it help you understand what the real significance of this is? When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit, began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Do you ever understand why the flame of fire is sitting on top of people's heads? Because this is the fulfillment of Ezekiel. This is better than Ezekiel. I mean, and what this is saying things are changing. So instead of the Spirit of God coming back to the temple where Zerubbabel rebuilt it, God says, no, I'm not coming back, not good enough. Jesus comes back and they say, no, we don't want you either, God. But Jesus says, okay, I'll tell you what, actually this is good, because if I go away, I will send another Spirit to you. So what have we got? Well, what have we got now is the Spirit of God coming, sitting on top of little temples, little mobile temples, who can then go out into the rest of the world and preach the gospel to every creature, right? So it's an incredible signal that God's program has moved on from one stone temple where you had to come to it, to living and dwelling in people with that little flame of fire on top, right, at least symbolically, to then go out and spread the message that way. So, this is why Paul also says, and makes a big deal in 1 Corinthians, don't you know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who's in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you were bought at a price, therefore honor God with your body. And I think that's all I really need to tell you about Ezekiel. Okay? You with me? You good? Okay. That's all we're going to do about Ezekiel. Again, it'll be my responsibility to hide from him in heaven, so help me out. If you see him coming, let me know. Okay? Now, let's get to Haggai and Zechariah. And we have been through parts of this before. We've been through some of the background in order to help get you ready for the story of Esther and understanding that. So I'm not going to go over all of it. We've seen that a couple times now. I'm just going to go to a couple things we haven't seen. And the first one I want to talk about is, I don't want to talk about this, I'll just mention it. Why is there an exile? Well, you guys all know why there's an exile. Deuteronomy 28 says why there is an exile. Life during the exile was good, partly because Daniel was over there making life good for the people. which is kind of a bad thing because then they don't always want to go back. And not enough people actually did go back to the land, certainly not all that came. But I want to talk about the length of the exile. So let me just ask you this generally. How long is the exile supposed to be? 70 years, right? 70 years. But if you actually have done the math, none of it adds up. Because the temple is destroyed in 586 and the people go back in 536. Right? Ain't any kind of base 8 math or however you'd have to do it to make that work. That's not 70 years, that's 50 years. So why do we say it's 70 years? Well, 2 reasons. And 2 reasons are these. If you take a look at when the people were first deported, the people were first taken away. Not everybody was, but a lot of people were, and Daniel himself was part of it. They were taken away in 605, and they came back in 536. The temple, on the other hand, was destroyed in 586, but the temple wasn't actually rebuilt until 516. So you see that the people are gone for 70 years, the temple's gone for 70 years. Those 70 years aren't exactly the same, but that's why we just kind of generally say the exile lasts for 70 years. People are gone that long, temple's gone that long, even though they kind of don't overlap at the same time. All right? Now, I really am sorry about the tribulation that's going to come upon you next week. I am. I wish I didn't have to torture you, but I do have to test you. And so I know that when you're tired and you've got all those exams and your brain is drained anyway, you're going to come to this little map, this little chart, and say, oh gosh, does he expect us to know that? All those details, so much there. And the answer is a little bit. I'll tell you the 3 things I want you to know from this chart. Okay? Here are the 3 things I want you to know. The first thing is this, that because the chart starts in 536, the exile is that way, it's in past, and everything here is post-exile. That's the first thing I want you to know, that this whole chart and everything on here is stuff that is going on after the exile is over, post-exile, okay? And one of the implications, of course, is Esther's sitting right here in the middle of it, and Esther is up here in Susa, or up here in Persia, long after she could go back. That's kind of point number 1. But Malachi, Chronicles, all that stuff is happening in here. The second thing is this. I want you to take a look at Haggai and Zechariah and our little line coming down here, okay? I want you to see that Haggai and Zechariah, I want you to see the timing of their ministry. And so I'm going to start like this and say, we're going to start with this little tiny green dot right there. Right? And what that little tiny green dot means is that when Zerubbabel came back and he started on his mission, it was a go. It was a green. It was a go for 1 year. And then for 15 years or 16 years, it was stopped. The people of the land didn't want a temple rebuilt. They thought the Jewish people would be very nationalistic and rebel, and it would be bad for them. So they were able to stop it. Well, at that point then, in 520 BC, and we know this because Haggai dates his prophecies incredibly specifically. He'll say, this prophecy came on September 22nd, 520 BC. I mean, he won't use our September, but he'll use Hebrew months, right? And then October and November and December, right? Over 4 months. So Haggai and Zechariah come along together, and it is their singular goal to get that temple rebuilt. And so Haggai and Zechariah work together, and through their efforts, the temple is restarted and finished in 516. Right? So here's the second thing I want you to know. Second thing I want you to know is that the temple gets started with the green line, it gets stopped for 20 years, 16 years, and then they work together and get it going again, right? Because they are kind of like team prophets. They work together, right? You good? All right, third thing, just the third thing I want you to know is this. You see the funny way I've done Ezra here? what I want you to see is this, that the amount of time between chapter 6 and chapter 7 is huge. It is, 80 years or so. When Ezra writes his book, he's writing here because this is when he lives. So that this is Ezra's lifetime, and this is actually ancient history to him. So the first 6 chapters of Ezra are about the rebuilding of the temple, but it's because in order to show his story in 7 to 10, he wants to go back in history and pick out an event that will perfectly set up what he wants to do. Right? So it's like you're writing a story about today, but in order to get that story across, you got to go back and tell something about World War I as kind of the introduction to it. So Ezra lives back here. The building of the temple, first 6 chapters, in a long gap, and then he finishes up with his little book. Right? So that's it. That's it. You don't have to know the other. You don't have to know 458 and 445 and 464 and 415. You don't have to know that stuff. Don't worry about it. Just those 3 big ideas. Jordan? You don't have to know it. Why do you put it up there? Because it gives us some context for showing what's going on here. Right? Fair enough? Because if I didn't, someone would say, well, when did Nehemiah come back? And so I had to put it up there. Which would probably be you. You would probably be the one.
I was going to ask, why don't we cover Nehemiah in the whole book?
Why don't we cover Nehemiah in the whole book? Because, and this is time for a life lesson, Jordan. Okay? Because you just can't do everything.
I know.
You just...
Right, the reason to figure it now, there's too much
I know. You can't do everything. You wish you could. You wish you could be everybody's friend, but you can't.
Should have mentioned that in the chapel this morning.
Yeah, I know. Can't do everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let's go on. Let's take a look at the stories of Haggai and Zechariah, and let me say this. These 2 guys function together like good cop and bad cop. They have very different styles, but very singular in purpose to see the temple reconstruction completed. So it's kind of an interesting, it is a really interesting kind of life lesson. I'll admit that. It is kind of an interesting life lesson about the kind of people that God uses and the kind of personalities and the styles that he uses. These guys are really, really different. They motivate the people very different ways. One guy is very harsh and in your face and says, look, you've got to go get the tree and cut it down and build the temple. Right? That's what one of the guys is like. The other guy is like, oh, I just want to encourage you so much because this is just going to have such a wonderful ending. I can see your GPA right now, and it's like a 4.2. It's just wonderful, and it's going to be so good. And doesn't that make you want to, study or whatever? And just very different styles, but yet God uses both of them together. It's not just one style of worker or, preacher or whatever. God uses them together. So this is what they're doing. They're very different styles, but they're working for the same goal. So one of them is direct, the other is very kind of indirect. One is very practical, one is very visionary, one is very immediate. Let's get this done today. The other one is like, man, if you build it, he will come. Messiah will come to this temple. If you build it, he will come. Really, that's what he says. Right? One is very specific, the other is very general. So I don't know, if you skimmed them over, can you guess which is which? The guy who's really, really direct is Haggai, and Zechariah is the guy who is very visionary. So, poor Haggai is going to be chasing me around too, because I'm not even going to talk about his book. I'm just going to go show you a couple things about Zechariah. Okay? Zechariah is known for 8 night visions. I think there's a test question that actually asks that. Gives you about 5 different prophets and says, who's known for their 8 night visions? This is the answer. Okay? Just to make your life a little easier, next week. Zechariah has 8 night visions. And here's the first one. It's about some horses and riders, and it's about God avenging the nation. So it goes like this. During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man riding a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses, 4 horsemen. And they reported, we have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace. Now, at this point, as you're reading through the book, you think, well, that's nice. That's sweet. You know, that's what every beauty queen wants. We finally got world peace. But it's not. It's a really, really bad thing. And the best way I can explain it is this. My cousin lived in the house right next to us. He was 4 years older than I was. Still is. And when you're 12 and you're 16, that makes a big difference in, you know, your size. And so my cousin thought that one of the best things in the summertime to do was to come over and to get me down on my back, right, and sit on my stomach and put his knees on my arms, and then he would rip grass out of the ground and he would stuff it up my nose. Or even worse, kind of gently tickle it, you know. It's like, oh, I just hated that, but I couldn't do anything about it. And one time he was doing this pretty close to our house, and I think it happened all the time. And I heard my mom from inside the kitchen. She was yelling, "Are you boys okay out there?" And I thought, oh man, this is my chance, right? So I start to yell out, and my cousin takes his hand and goes, and he says, "Yeah, everything's fine," right? I'm thinking, but I don't have any choice, right? And so it's like, okay, everything's peaceful. Yeah, it was for him, but not for me, right? I'm sitting there on the ground, struggling, you know, for my life, and that's what's going on here, okay? Israel is on the ground. All the nations are at peace, and the nation's thinking, oh, everything's fine, and Israel's thinking, not for us. They're lording it over us. They're riding on us. They won't let us have a king. They won't let us do anything, and this is really, really bad, right? So even though the world seems to be at rest and in peace, it's not good for Israel, and God says, look, I was angry with the nations that feel secure. I was only a little angry, but they've added to the calamity. They've gone too far. Therefore, this is what the Lord says, I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord. I will come back, I will make sure this temple gets rebuilt, and I will make sure that this whole city gets rebuilt because I haven't forgotten them. Right? So it's kind of a visionary way to say, look, let's get together and pull up our sleeves and get this temple rebuilt because God says He's going to help. Now, other visions we could look at, but I'm going to go straight to this middle one because it's probably one of the most famous. And I guarantee you that even if you skimmed over in your reading, I'm going to read a verse for you that I'm sure you've heard before because it's a really famous one, but you might not know the historical context where it comes from. So this is the story of the golden lampstand, and it goes, the angel says, what do you see, Zechariah? I answered, I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it with 7 channels to the lights. Also, there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left. Now that doesn't make too much sense, so let me enlighten you with a beautifully drawn graphic. What we've got are trees with pipes that go to this. Now, I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not, but remember, this is a menorah. This is an oil-driven light. This is not a candle. This is not wax. So, if these are not maple trees, but they are olive trees, do you kind of sense what's going on here? How long will this thing light? How long will it stay burning? For a pretty long time, right? It's continually being infused with olive oil, so it's this thing that just keeps on burning and burning and burning, right? And so what God says is this. Look, I'll tell you what. Joshua, that high priest, there were 2 leaders. God raised up 2 leaders. The first one was priestly. His name was Joshua. The second one was royal. His name was Zerubbabel. God says, through these 2 guys, my Spirit is going to flow so that ultimately we produce a lighthouse for me. That is a temple. Right? This is the word of the Lord, Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. Right? Have you heard this verse? Have we all heard that verse at some point? But what it's talking about is the temple is going to get rebuilt by the power of the Spirit working through Joshua and Zerubbabel. What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become level ground. Then he, Zerubbabel, will bring out the capstone, the very top, last stone, to the shouts of, God bless it, God bless it. Okay? So again, another visionary thing about, hey, God's going to do this, so let's put our shoulder to the plow and get some work done. Now, the conclusion. This is after the 8 night visions. Even in your notes, notice it is 9b. Right? The first B's are the night visions. And so after those night visions are done, he comes along with one kind of really powerful, let's drive it home, object lesson. So here's what it is. We've got the high priest over here. You know he's the high priest for two reasons. Number one, he's got on blue. Everybody else has to wear white. High priest gets to wear blue. And number two, he's got the Urim and Thummim. He's got the stones that are kind of like a hotline to heaven. Now, that's just a generic picture because if you think about this carefully, remember they don't have that now. But anyway, this is just a picture of the high priest, okay? So here's what happens. God says, take the silver and the gold and make a crown, and a crown is something which kings wear, right? And set it on the head of the high priest Joshua, son of Jehozadak. Now, just stop right there for a second. If you are a good, orthodox, careful Jewish crowd who's listening to this story, what is your response to that statement? Yeah, you got to look at it and go, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't have the king and the priest in the same. You can't put a crown on the top of the high priest, because a couple hundred years from now, this is what's going to happen just before Jesus comes, and this is why the priesthood gets so stinking corrupt, because the priesthood starts to rule the country in the absence of a king, and things go south really fast because you put all that power in one hand or one head, and it gets corrupt pretty fast, right? So anyway, you would say, no, don't do that. But God says, no. Tell him, this is an object lesson, this is what the Lord Almighty says, here's the man whose name is the branch. Now, most of us look at that and think, huh? What's the branch? Well, watch this. It's really kind of fascinating. The branch turns out to be an Old Testament term that describes, well, I'll show you what it describes. It starts out in Isaiah 4. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. So you say, okay, that's really vague. I don't know what it is. Well, watch this. Isaiah 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Okay, now we know who Jesse is, right? Jesse is the father of David. When you talk about the stump of Jesse, what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. Do not laugh at my lack of graphical ability. Okay? What it means is this, that what we've got down here is Jesse in the stump, in the trunk, okay? And all of his kids, all of his sons, David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Huzaboam, all the other Boams, all the way up to Jehoiachin, are like these upper branches. But then, of course, the stump gets cut off. So what could that mean? Well, that means we don't have any kings on the throne, right? From 586 until now, there are no kings from Jesse's roots. But what happens when you take a tree and it gets worms in or something and you cut it off at the ground? What happens the next spring often? You ever seen this? Little branch, little thing will come up from the roots. Right? It's exactly what this is talking about. And do not laugh. Okay? It's best I got. Okay? It's the best I got. A branch comes up. I'm going to cover it up with the green so you can't make fun of it. But a branch comes up. And what it's saying is this branch is someone who comes out of the line of David after it's been cut off. Right? Starting to make sense now? So this is talking about a messianic king, because from Jesse come kings. So there's a Messiah who's going to come out of a place we didn't expect him to, because we thought the lineage was all cut off, but God's going to bring this branch out of it. And then when you go to Jeremiah, it gets even better. Days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch. So this Davidic ruler will be totally righteous, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just in the land. In those days at that time, I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land. Right? So you take all that, what you got is this, that the Old Testament is fond of using the word branch because it talks about, even though it's going to be in exile, and Zerubbabel is not going to get to be it, in a place where you wouldn't think Messiah is going to bring a root out of a dry ground, like Isaiah says. So when he does, then in Zechariah, God says, okay, let's bring this all back here. Take the silver and the gold, make a crown, set it on the head of the high priest, Joshua, son of Jehozadak. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here's a man whose name is the branch. So they take the high priest and they put the crown on him. And they say, there's the branch. What are you supposed to get? You're supposed to get the branch is going to be not only a king, but he's going to be a high priest too. And that's where it goes. He will branch out from his place and build a temple of the Lord, and he'll be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne, and there'll be harmony between the two offices. So right here in the book of Zechariah, like we saw in Psalm 110, we have a picture of a Messiah who is going to be like king and priest in one person. And there will be harmony between the two offices of king and priest. Now, let me speculate just for a second. I think this is a whole lot of fun. I can't prove this, but my guess is that once you make a crown like this, and you're waiting to put it on the head of the Messiah, you don't throw it away. It's expensive. You keep it. So where do you put it? Well, you probably put it up in the temple. How long does it sit there? Well, Zerubbabel hopes he's going to get to wear it, and no, they won't let him wear it, and Zerubbabel's son, and Zerubbabel's son's son, and Zerubbabel's son's son, right, until it's like, okay, nobody's ever wearing that thing. And it's sitting in the temple. Well, just imagine then this. The triumphal entry, the day comes. Jesus gets on the colt. He rides down the Kidron Valley, up into the eastern gate, into the temple, cleanses the temple, looks up, and then sees that crown there and says, I wonder if that's my size. Right? Because that's the head upon which it's supposed to fit. And this just makes the irony even worse, right? In the story of Matthew, when it says the soldiers beat Jesus, remember what they did? They put a robe on him, a royal robe, a purple robe, and they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they gave him a scepter, right out of Genesis 3. And with that scepter, they took the thorns and they beat him into his brow. And you can just see the satanic delight in that whole affair, right? Knowing that there was a crown there that was supposed to fit on his head, and they didn't take that, they took the other crown and they put it on his head. Well, seems like defeat. Seems like it's bad. Seems like it's all over. The whole plan went bad, right? But Jesus says, and God says, no, I can take that bad stuff and make it good, and he will come back again, and he'll ride on a war horse, and he will put the right crown on at some point in time, and what was supposed to happen the first time will eventually happen the second. So there is the story of the branch and the king and the priest, and the story of Israel before and after.